I probably looked like every other frazzled dog owner who'd ever walked through the glass doors of Pampered Paws premium pet salon that Tuesday morning. My hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, there were dark circles under my eyes from another sleepless night, and my jacket had suspicious white fur covering every inch of fabric despite my best efforts with the lint roller. In my hands, I gripped the leash of what most people would charitably call a handful, a 95-pound German shepherd named Atlas who had the energy of a caffeinated tornado and the stubborn streak of a mule. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The receptionist looked up from her appointment book with the kind of practiced smile that probably worked wonders on little old ladies with their perfectly behaved Pomeranians, but faltered slightly when she saw Atlas pulling me toward the treat display like I was water skiing behind a speedboat. "Sarah Mitchell?" she asked, consulting her tablet with manicured fingernails that had probably never been chipped by a determined dog's claws. "That's me," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady as Atlas decided that now would be the perfect time to investigate whether the potted plant by the window was friend or foe. The plant lost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The salon was exactly what you'd expect from a place that charged more for a dog bath than most people spent on their own haircuts. Everything was pristine white and chrome, with motivational posters featuring perfectly groomed poodles and golden retrievers looking like they'd stepped out of a magazine. The air smelled like expensive shampoo and the kind of artificial lavender that was supposed to be calming but mostly just made my sinuses itch. I'd been dreading this appointment for weeks. Atlas wasn't just difficult, he was the kind of dog that made professional trainers hand me their business cards with apologetic expressions and suggestions about specialist programs. 3 grooming appointments at different salons had ended in disaster. The first place had called me after 20 minutes to pick him up immediately. The second had literally refunded my money and asked me never to return. The third had resulted in a very expensive visit to the veterinarian after Atlas had somehow managed to get his head stuck in a grooming noose while trying to chase his own tail. My veterinarian, Dr. Helena Vasquez, had recommended Pampered Paws with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she might have been getting a commission. "They handled difficult cases," she'd assured me while examining the latest set of scratches on my forearms. "The owner, Marcus, he's supposedly worked with police dogs and rescue animals. If anyone can manage Atlas, it's them." That had been 3 weeks ago, and I'd been on their waiting list ever since. 3 weeks of Atlas destroying my apartment with the methodical efficiency of a small earthquake. 3 weeks of neighbors complaining about the barking. 3 weeks of coming home to find that he'd somehow figured out how to open cabinet doors and had decided that my favorite shoes made excellent chew toys. The truth was, I was running out of options. My landlord had already sent one warning letter about excessive noise and property damage, and I was pretty sure my security deposit was a lost cause at this point. The pet store where I bought his food had started giving me the kind of looks usually reserved for people who show up to grocery stores in their pajamas at 3 in the morning. Even my mother, who had raised 5 children and 2 St. Bernards, had taken one look at Atlas during our last video call and suggested maybe I should consider getting a nice, quiet goldfish instead. But here's the thing about giving up. It wasn't really an option for me. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was pride, or maybe it was something deeper than that, something that had been drilled into me during years when quitting meant more than just disappointment. I'd found Atlas at the county shelter 18 months ago, and from the moment I'd seen him cowering in the back corner of his kennel, I'd known we belonged together. The fact that he came with more baggage than a cross-country flight wasn't going to change that. The shelter volunteers had warned me about his history. Abandonment issues, they'd said, trust problems, probably some trauma from his previous owners who'd surrendered him after he'd allegedly destroyed their house and terrorized the neighborhood. They'd used words like challenging and special needs with the careful tone of people who'd learned that honesty didn't always help dogs find homes. But I'd seen something else in those dark brown eyes when he'd finally crept close enough to sniff my outstretched hand. Recognition, maybe, or just the desperate hope of someone who'd been let down too many times but was still willing to try one more time. I knew that feeling better than I cared to admit. "Ms. Mitchell?" A man emerged from the back of the salon, and I could tell immediately that this was Marcus, the owner Dr. Vasquez had raved about. He was probably in his 50s, with the kind of patient expression that suggested he'd seen everything the pet world had to offer. His gray hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and his hands bore the telltale scars of someone who'd spent years working with animals that didn't always appreciate the help. "That's me," I said again, and Atlas chose that moment to demonstrate his special talent for making terrible first impressions by lunging toward a cage containing what appeared to be a very expensive Persian cat. The cat hissed with the indignation of royalty, and Atlas responded with a bark that probably registered on seismic equipment. Marcus didn't even flinch. Instead, he crouched down to Atlas's level, not approaching, but simply making himself smaller, less threatening. It was a subtle gesture, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice, but I found myself watching his movements with interest. He held his hand loosely at his side, palm down, letting Atlas catch his scent without feeling pressured to interact. "German Shepherd," he observed, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "Working line, from the look of him. High drive, high intelligence. Probably doesn't get enough mental stimulation." I blinked in surprise. Most people took one look at Atlas and immediately started lecturing me about dominance training or suggesting that maybe I should have gotten a smaller dog. "You can tell all that just from looking at him?" Marcus stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Atlas, who had calmed down enough to stop pulling toward the cat, but was still vibrating with the kind of barely contained energy that made me feel like I was holding a live wire. "23 years in this business," he said. "You learn to read the signs. This boy isn't mean, he's just bored out of his mind. Probably too smart for his own good." "Tell me about it," I muttered, thinking about the time Atlas had figured out how to open the treat container that I'd hidden on top of the refrigerator. He's like a furry Houdini with separation anxiety. "Let me guess," Marcus continued, studying Atlas with the focused attention of someone solving a puzzle. "Previous owners probably tried to tire him out with just physical exercise. Lots of walks, maybe some dog park visits, but no real job to do. Am I close?" I stared at him. "How did you know that?" "Because dogs like this one were bred to work. Their brains need exercise as much as their bodies. Without a purpose, they tend to create their own entertainment, and it's usually not the kind of entertainment their humans appreciate." For the first time since I'd adopted Atlas, someone was talking about his behavior like it made sense, instead of like he was just a bad dog with no hope of redemption. I felt something tight in my chest start to loosen, just a little. "So you think you can handle him?" I asked, trying not to sound too hopeful. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment, and I'd had enough of that for one lifetime. Marcus was quiet for a moment, still watching Atlas, who had now decided that the best use of his time was trying to determine whether his own reflection in the chrome base of a grooming table was friend or foe. "I think we'll get along just fine," he said finally. "But I have to ask, have you had experience with working dogs before? There's something about the way you handle him, the way you position yourself when he gets reactive. Most people either yank on the leash or freeze up, but you do neither." I felt heat creep up my neck. This was always the tricky part, the moment when people started asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. "I've had dogs before," I said carefully, which was true enough, it just wasn't the whole truth. "Military?" Marcus asked, and there was something in his tone that made me look at him more carefully. "What makes you say that?" "The way you scan the room when you walk in. The way you keep your back to the wall without even thinking about it. The fact that you're more relaxed with a 95-pound German Shepherd than most people are with golden retrievers." He paused, studying my face. "Plus, there's something about your posture, the way you carry yourself. I've seen it before." I felt my carefully constructed civilian facade starting to crack. This was exactly why I'd moved to Millbrook Falls after my discharge 2 years ago. Small mountain town, population barely pushing 8,000, the kind of place where people minded their own business and nobody asked too many questions about your past. I'd found a job at the local library, bought a small house on the outskirts of town, and done my best to blend in with the other quiet residents who seemed content to live their lives without much drama. The problem was that Atlas made blending in impossible. It was hard to be inconspicuous when your dog could open doors, scale 6-foot fences, and had once figured out how to turn on the kitchen faucet because he preferred running water to the perfectly good bowl I'd left out for him. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded hollow. Marcus had the kind of observational skills that came from years of reading animal behavior, and apparently humans.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
He's not showing any displacement behaviors. No panting, no excessive drooling, no pacing. That tells me he's processing the environment without going into full stress mode. I found myself impressed despite my determination to keep my guard up. Most people saw Atlas's size and energy level and immediately assumed he was either aggressive or uncontrollable. Marcus was the first person to look at him and see intelligence and sensitivity instead of problems to be solved. "How long have you been working with dogs?" I asked, genuinely curious now. "Started when I was 12, Marcus said, kneeling down to let Atlas investigate his hands more thoroughly. "My uncle had a veterinary practice, and he put me to work cleaning kennels and walking the boarding dogs. Turns out I had a knack for the difficult cases, the ones that other people had given up on. What made you good at it?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his hands moving in slow, gentle strokes along Atlas's neck as my dog decided that this particular human might be worth trusting. "I guess I understood what it felt like to be misunderstood," he said finally. "To have people look at you and see only the problems instead of the potential." There was something in his voice that made me look at him more carefully. This was a man who understood more than just animal behavior, I realized. This was someone who'd learned about trust and patience and the slow work of healing in ways that went beyond professional training. "You mentioned you'd worked with police dogs," I asked, trying to keep my voice casual now. "Among others," Marcus replied. His attention still focused on Atlas, who was now leaning into the gentle scratching behind his ears with the kind of blissful expression he usually reserved for dinner time. "Military working dogs, search and rescue, some private security work. Dogs that had jobs to do, basically. Dogs like your boy here." The words hit me like a physical blow, though I tried not to let it show on my face. Military working dogs. I knew all about military working dogs, about the specialized training and the incredible bond between handler and animal. I knew about the intelligence and loyalty and the devastating loss when that partnership was broken. I also knew that Marcus was watching me carefully, noting my reaction to his words with the same careful attention he'd been paying to Atlas's body language. The problem with people who were trained to read behavioral cues was that they didn't limit that skill to animals. "That must have been interesting work," I managed to say, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "It was," Marcus agreed. "Challenging, rewarding, sometimes heartbreaking, but always worthwhile. There's nothing quite like the bond between a working dog and their handler when everything clicks into place." Atlas had settled down beside Marcus now, his massive head resting against the man's knee with the kind of trust that usually took my dog weeks to develop. It was remarkable, really, watching this transformation from the anxious, reactive animal who dragged me through the front door to this calm, focused dog who seemed to have found exactly what he'd been looking for. "He likes you," I observed, and there was something almost like betrayal in my voice. Atlas was supposed to be loyal to me, not immediately abandoning our team for the first person who knew how to scratch behind his ears properly. "He recognizes something familiar," Marcus corrected gently. "Dogs like this, they're looking for structure, for someone who understands what they need. They can sense when someone knows how to work with them instead of against them. And you know how to work with them. I learned from the best, Marcus said. And there was a note of sadness in his voice that suggested this story didn't have a happy ending. Had a partner once, a Belgian Malinois named Sergeant. Smartest dog I ever worked with, and that's saying something. Could track a scent through a thunderstorm, detect explosives from 50 yards away, and still had enough energy left over to play fetch for hours. I felt my chest tighten because I knew how these stories usually ended. Military working dogs, police dogs, they didn't retire to peaceful lives of leisure and belly rubs. They worked until they couldn't work anymore, and then they left behind handlers who understood exactly what kind of hole they'd carved out of their hearts. "What happened to him?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands still moving in those slow, gentle strokes through Atlas's fur. "ID," he said finally, the words so quiet I almost missed them. "Afghanistan, 2018. We were on patrol, thought we'd cleared the route. Sergeant detected something the sweeps had missed, but he trailed off, his jaw tight with old pain." I didn't need him to finish the story. I knew how those stories ended because I'd lived through enough of them myself. The sudden explosion, the ringing silence afterward, the frantic search through smoke and debris for your partner, the terrible moment when you realized that all your training and all your love hadn't been enough to keep them safe. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. Losing a partner like that, I stopped myself before I could say too much, before I could reveal that I understood that particular kind of grief from personal experience. But Marcus looked up at me with eyes that seemed to see straight through all my carefully constructed walls. "You know," he said, and it wasn't a question. I felt my breath catch in my throat because this was the moment I'd been dreading since I'd walked through the front door. This was when my carefully maintained civilian identity started to crumble, when someone saw past the librarian facade to the person I'd tried so hard to leave behind. "I don't know what you mean," I said, but the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. Marcus studied my face with the same careful attention he'd been giving Atlas, reading the micro-expressions I thought I'd learned to control. "German Shepherd," he said quietly. "High drive, high intelligence, probably from working lines. Adoption from a shelter, but you handle him like someone who's worked with military dogs before. You scan rooms automatically, keep your back to walls, and you knew exactly what I meant when I talked about displacement behaviors." My heart was pounding now, the careful calm I'd cultivated over the past 2 years starting to fracture under the weight of being truly seen for the first time since my discharge. This was exactly why I'd chosen Millbrook Falls, exactly why I'd taken a quiet job at the library and bought a house on the edge of town where my nearest neighbor was half a mile away. I didn't want to be seen. I didn't want to be recognized. I didn't want to have to explain what I'd left behind and why I'd chosen to leave it. "You're imagining things," I said, but my voice was shaking now, and I could feel Atlas looking up at me with the concerned expression he wore when he sensed my distress. "Ms. Mitchell," Marcus said gently, "I've been working with military and law enforcement personnel for over 20 years. I know what combat stress looks like, and I know what it means when someone who's clearly had professional training with working dogs shows up with a shelter rescue who's obviously been through his own trauma." The words hit me like a physical blow because he was right, because he'd seen through every carefully constructed lie I'd been telling myself about starting over and leaving the past behind. Atlas wasn't just a pet I'd rescued from the shelter. He was a kindred spirit, another casualty of a war that had taken everything from both of us and left us to figure out how to rebuild ourselves from whatever pieces remained. "I don't talk about my service," I said finally, the words coming out harder than I'd intended. "It's not something I discuss with strangers." "I understand," Marcus said, and there was genuine compassion in his voice. "But I want you to know that if you ever change your mind, I'm someone who gets it. The transition from military to civilian life, the challenge of finding purpose when your whole identity was wrapped up in the job, the way these dogs become more than just partners." He gestured to Atlas, who was still leaning against his knee with the kind of trust that had taken me months to earn. Dogs like this, they don't forget their training any more than we do. They're looking for someone who understands what they were bred for, what they were meant to do. And sometimes that means finding someone who's walked a similar path. I stared down at Atlas, at his intelligent brown eyes and his alert ears, and the way he seemed to have found something in Marcus that I'd been unable to provide despite 18 months of trying. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe I'd been so focused on trying to heal my own wounds that I'd forgotten Atlas had his own healing to do. The shelter said he had abandonment issues, I said quietly. Trust problems. His previous owners couldn't handle him. Previous owners probably didn't understand what they were dealing with, Marcus replied. These dogs, especially the ones from working lines, they need jobs. They need structure and purpose, and someone who can challenge their intelligence. Without that, they turn into furry tornadoes with separation anxiety. So what do you suggest? Marcus stood slowly, his movement careful and deliberate to avoid startling Atlas. Well, first we get him properly groomed so he's more comfortable in his own skin. But after that, we might want to talk about some specialized training. There are programs for retired working dogs, ways to give them purpose without putting them back in harm's way. What kind of programs? Therapy work, search and rescue training, even some private security work. The point is giving them a job that uses their skills and intelligence without the combat stress. He paused, studying my face again. Of course, that kind of training works best when the handler has experience with working dogs. Someone who understands the commands, the mindset, the way these partnerships are supposed to function. I felt something shift in my chest, something that might have been hope if I was brave enough to name it. For 18 months, I'd been trying to force Atlas into the mold of a pet, trying to make him content with walks around the neighborhood and games of fetch in the backyard. But what if that wasn't what either of us needed? What if we'd both been looking for the same thing all along? A way to use our training for something meaningful without the weight of life.
Marcus's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their careful work. What was his name? Her name was Luna, I corrected, and just saying it out loud sent a familiar stab of pain through my chest. 70 pounds of pure determination wrapped up in a package that could clear a building or detect ordnance from 100 yards away. How long were you partnered? 4 years, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. From her advanced training graduation until... I trailed off because some stories were still too raw to tell, even to someone who might understand them. Until you came home, Marcus finished gently, his tone suggesting he knew exactly what kind of homecoming I was talking about. She didn't, I said simply, and that was all I could manage. We worked in comfortable silence for several minutes, Marcus continuing his methodical grooming, while Atlas stood patiently, occasionally glancing back at me as if to make sure I was still there. The rhythm was soothing, almost meditative, and I found myself relaxing in ways I hadn't in months. That's when the screaming started. It came from the front of the salon, high-pitched and terrified, followed immediately by a crash that sounded like breaking glass and overturning furniture. Marcus's head snapped up, his entire body going alert in a way that told me his military training hadn't been completely buried under years of civilian life either. "Stay with Atlas," he said, already moving toward the door. But I was right behind him, because that scream had triggered every protective instinct I'd spent 4 years developing, and whatever was happening in the front room required immediate attention. We burst through the doorway together to find absolute chaos. A massive Rottweiler was loose in the reception area, his hackles raised and his lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed teeth like white daggers. The receptionist was pressed against the far wall, her face pale with terror, while an elderly woman clutched a small terrier to her chest and tried to make herself invisible behind an overturned chair. Glass from a shattered picture frame glittered across the floor, and the potted plant that Atlas had investigated earlier was now scattered in chunks of dirt and ceramic. But it was the figure hunched in the corner that made my blood run cold. A young woman, maybe 19 or 20, was curled up on the floor with her arms wrapped around her head, while the Rottweiler stood over her, not attacking, but clearly agitated and protective. Blood was trickling from scratches on her arms, and she was making soft, broken sounds that spoke of trauma much deeper than whatever had just happened. "Call animal control," Marcus said quietly to his receptionist, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. Animal control would take at least 20 minutes to respond, and this situation was balanced on a knife's edge that could tip toward violence at any moment. The Rottweiler's attention shifted to us, and I felt my training kick in like muscle memory. Everything slowed down, and suddenly I could read the dog's body language as clearly as words on a page. This wasn't an aggressive animal. This was a scared, protective dog who'd found someone even more vulnerable than himself and was trying to guard her from a world that had already hurt them both too much. "He's not vicious," I said quietly, my voice carrying the calm authority that had been drilled into me during years of working with high-stress situations. "He's scared and defensive. Look at his ears, the way he's holding his tail. He's trying to create a safe space for her." "You sure about that?" Marcus asked, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was seeing the same thing I was. "Positive," I replied, already moving slowly toward the pair in the corner. "He's not showing any predatory behavior, no resource guarding aggression. He's in protection mode, not attack mode." The Rottweiler's eyes tracked my movement, but he didn't advance or retreat. Instead, he shifted slightly, placing himself more squarely between me and the girl on the floor. It was a clear message delivered with canine eloquence. "I see you, I'm watching you, and I'll defend her if necessary, but I'd prefer not to fight if you don't force me to." "Easy, big guy," I said, crouching down to make myself less threatening while maintaining enough distance to avoid triggering his protective instincts. "Nobody here wants to hurt her. We want to help." Behind me, I could hear Marcus directing his receptionist to clear the other customers out of the immediate area and keep anyone else from entering. Smart thinking. Too many people, too much chaos, and this whole situation could explode into something much worse. The girl on the floor raised her head slightly, and I got my first clear look at her face. She was young, probably college-aged, with the kind of hollow-eyed exhaustion that spoke of weeks or months of inadequate sleep and poor nutrition. Her clothes were clean but worn, and there was something about the way she held herself that reminded me of soldiers coming back from deployment, hyper-vigilant, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. "What's your name?" I asked her quietly, keeping my voice soft and non-threatening. "Riley," she whispered, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "His name is Titan. He's all I have left." The Rottweiler, Titan, relaxed slightly at the sound of her voice, but his eyes never left mine. I could see the bond between them, the kind of desperate mutual dependence that developed between trauma survivors who'd learned to rely on each other for basic survival. "Riley, I'm Sarah," I said, keeping eye contact with her while keeping Titan in my peripheral vision. "This is Marcus, and this is his grooming salon. Can you tell me what happened?" "I was just trying to find somewhere warm," Riley said, tears starting to track down her cheeks. "It's been so cold at night, and Titan hasn't eaten in 2 days. I thought maybe if I brought him here, pretended I had an appointment, I could at least get him some water and maybe use the bathroom to clean up before they kicked us out." My heart clenched, because I recognized that particular brand of desperation, not from personal experience, thankfully, but from the homeless veterans I'd encountered during my own transition back to civilian life. The pride that made asking for help impossible, combined with the protective instinct that put their animal companions' needs above their basic survival. But then the lady behind the counter started asking for my appointment information, and Titan could tell I was getting upset, and when she reached for the phone to call someone, he was trying to protect me. I glanced back at Marcus, who was watching the interaction with the focused attention of someone who dealt with crisis situations before. Her receptionist was hovering near the back door, ready to flee if things went sideways, but Marcus himself looked calm and calculating. "Riley," I said, turning my attention back to the pair in the corner, "I need you to listen very carefully. Titan is trying to keep you safe, which means he's going to react to anything he perceives as a threat to you. Right now, that includes me, Marcus, and anyone else who gets too close. But he's also stressed and confused, and stressed dogs make unpredictable decisions." She nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I know. I've been trying to keep him calm, but he hasn't been sleeping well either, and when I get scared, he gets scared and—" "It's okay," I said firmly. "We're going to figure this out. But first, I need to ask you something important. Has Titan had any training, obedience work, anything like that?" Riley shook her head. "Not really. He was my boyfriend's dog originally, but when Jake died, I couldn't afford professional training. I've been trying to teach him basic commands from YouTube videos, but..." "What happened to Jake?" I asked gently, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. "Overdose," Riley whispered, fresh tears spilling over. "3 months ago. We were living together, and when he died, his family took everything. Furniture, electronics, even most of his clothes. They said I had no legal right to anything, including Titan, but they didn't want the dog anyway because he was too much trouble. So it's just been us, trying to figure out how to survive." The picture was becoming clearer now, and it was painting itself in shades of tragedy I knew all too well. Young woman loses her partner, finds herself homeless with a large, undertrained dog and no support system. 3 months of living rough, probably staying in shelters when they'd accept them both, sleeping in cars or abandoned buildings when they wouldn't. No wonder both of them were operating on pure survival instinct. "Riley," Marcus said from behind me, voice gentle but authoritative, "we're not going to call anyone to take Titan away from you, but we need to get both of you calmed down before someone gets hurt. Can you trust us to help?" Riley looked between us, and I could see the internal battle playing out on her face. Trust was a luxury she probably couldn't afford, but desperation was a powerful motivator, and they were clearly at the end of their resources. "How do I know you won't just call the police once Titan calms down?" she asked. "Because I've been there you are," I said quietly, and meant it. Not homeless, thankfully, but definitely lost and angry, and trying to figure out how to rebuild a life that had been shattered by circumstances beyond my control. And because Marcus has been working with difficult dogs and their people for longer than you've been alive. We're not the enemy here. Titan shifted slightly, and I could see him processing the change in emotional tone. Dogs are incredibly sensitive to human stress levels, and our calm conversation was probably helping him relax despite his protective instincts. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "First, I need you to sit up slowly," I instructed. "Titan's been guarding you while you were curled up on the floor, which puts him in a defensive mindset. If you can change your body position, it might help him understand that the immediate threat has passed." Riley pushed herself up carefully, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who'd learned not to make sudden movements around a reactive animal. Titan immediately adjusted his position, staying close to her, but no longer standing directly over her in guard mode. It was a clear message delivered with canine eloquence. "I see you, I'm watching you, and I'll defend her if necessary, but I'd prefer not to fight if you don't force me to." "Easy, big guy," I said, crouching down to make myself less threatening while maintaining enough distance to avoid triggering his protective instincts. "Nobody here wants to hurt her. We want to help." Behind me, I could hear Marcus directing his receptionist to clear the other customers out of the immediate area and keep anyone else from entering. Smart thinking. Too many people, too much chaos, and this whole situation could explode into something much worse. The Rottweiler's attention shifted to us, and I felt my training kick in like muscle memory.
I've been trying to teach him that for months, and he's never. Marcus made a soft sound behind me that might have been surprise or recognition. When I glanced back at him, his eyes were narrow with calculation, like he was putting together pieces of a puzzle that had suddenly started making sense. "Titan, down," I said, testing my theory. The big dog immediately dropped to his belly, though he kept his head up and alert. It was a textbook response to a command given by someone he recognized as having authority. "Son of a bitch," Marcus breathed, and this time there was no question about the recognition in his voice. He's had professional training, military or police, from the look of that response. I felt pieces clicking into place in my own mind. A young man with a highly trained protection dog, living with a girlfriend who didn't know about the training, dying suddenly of an overdose. It painted a picture that was all too familiar in the veteran community. "Riley," I said carefully, "what did Jake do for work?" She was staring at Titan like she'd never seen him before. "He said he was in construction, but he traveled a lot for jobs. Sometimes he'd be gone for weeks at a time, and when he came back, he was always different, quieter. He had nightmares." "Did he ever talk about his time in the military?" Riley's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "He said he'd been in the army, but he never wanted to talk about it. Said it was in the past, and he just wanted to move on." I felt the familiar ache of recognition because I knew exactly what Jake had been trying to move on from. The kind of experiences that left you with nightmares and a highly trained dog who'd probably saved his life more than once overseas. Titan isn't just a pet, I said gently. He's a working dog, probably explosive detection or patrol work, maybe both. Jake brought him home when he got out, and Titan's been trying to do his job ever since. What job? Riley asked, confusion clear in her voice. Protecting his handler, Marcus said from behind me, and when I looked back at him, his expression was grave. These dogs don't retire when they come home. They just transfer their loyalty to their new pack and keep working. That's when it hit me, the full scope of what we were dealing with. Titan wasn't just a scared, reactive dog acting out because of stress and poor training. He was a highly trained military working dog who'd lost his handler and was now trying to protect the only family he had left with no guidance about how to do that in civilian situations. Riley, I said, I need to tell you something important about Titan and about what's been happening with him over the past 3 months. But before I could continue, Marcus stepped forward, his movement careful and deliberate. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a formal note that made both Riley and me look at him more carefully. "I don't know your last name," he continued, "but I'm willing to bet it's Carter. And I'm guessing that if I asked around the right military circles, I'd find records of a K-9 handler named Commander Carter who served multiple deployments with explosive detection specialists." My heart stopped beating for a moment because nobody in Millbrook Falls knew about my rank, about my service record, about any of it. I'd deliberately chosen this place precisely because I could disappear into the background and never have to answer questions about who I'd been before. "How did you—" I started, but Marcus held up a hand. "Because I've been waiting 2 years for you to walk through my door," he said, "and I think it's time you knew why." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, and I felt the careful walls I'd built around my new identity begin to crumble. Marcus stood there watching me with eyes that held too much knowledge, too much understanding, and I realized that my carefully orchestrated disappearance into small-town anonymity had been nothing more than an illusion. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, but even as the denial left my lips, I knew it sounded as hollow as it felt. Titan was still lying at my feet in perfect formation. Riley was staring between us with growing confusion, and Atlas had somehow slipped out from the grooming area and was now sitting beside me with the alert attention of a dog who sensed his handler was in distress. Marcus reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been carried around for months. He unfolded it carefully, and I caught a glimpse of military letterhead before he turned it toward me. "Colonel Patricia Hendricks, Walter Reed Medical Center," he read. "Requesting placement assistance for discharged K-9 handler, highly decorated combat veteran experiencing severe adjustment difficulties following loss of military working dog partner. Handler requesting complete anonymity and remote location placement. Skills include explosive detection, tactical operations, personnel protection, and advanced K-9 behavioral modification." My mouth went dry because I remembered that letter, remembered the humiliating conversation with Colonel Hendricks about my inability to function in normal military environments after Luna's death, about my need to disappear somewhere quiet where I could try to piece myself back together without the weight of everyone's expectations. "The letter came with a recommendation to contact me specifically," Marcus continued, "because of my background working with military veterans and their animals. It also came with a very specific request to maintain complete confidentiality about your presence in this area." Riley was looking between us like she was trying to follow a conversation in a foreign language. "I don't understand," she said. "Sarah, you're in the military?" "Was," I corrected automatically, then felt angry at myself for the admission. "I was in the military. That's in the past." "No, it's not," Marcus said firmly, and there was something in his voice that reminded me of drill sergeants and commanding officers, the tone of someone who wasn't going to let me hide behind comfortable lies. "You can take the soldier out of the service, Commander, but you can't take the service out of the soldier. And frankly, we need you." "We?" I asked, though I was starting to have a sinking feeling about where this conversation was heading. "The K-9 Veteran Assistance Network," Marcus said. "It's a non-profit I started 3 years ago, connecting retired military working dogs with handlers who understand their needs, providing support for veterans like Riley here who've inherited working dogs without understanding what they're dealing with, and helping people like you find purpose again."
The room seemed to tilt slightly, and I felt Atlas lean against my leg with the solid, reassuring weight of a dog who knew his person needed grounding. Riley was still sitting on the floor with Titan, but now she was looking at both of us with dawning understanding. "You're both military?" she said, and it wasn't a question. "Retired," Marcus corrected. 23 years, Army Special Forces, worked with K-9 units throughout Afghanistan and Iraq. When I got out, I discovered that a lot of working dogs were ending up in situations like Titan's current circumstances, with civilian families who loved them but had no idea how to handle their specialized training and trauma responses. He gestured toward Riley and Titan, who was still maintaining his perfect downstay despite the emotional chaos swirling around him. Young man loses his handler to suicide, overdose, or just the inability to cope with civilian life. Dog gets transferred to family member or girlfriend who inherits 90 pounds of highly trained military equipment with no instruction manual and no support system. The pieces were falling into place now, painting a picture that was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Jake, struggling with his own demons after coming home from war, trying to maintain some semblance of normal life with Riley while dealing with whatever trauma had driven him to self-medicate. Titan, trained to detect threats and protect his handler, watching his person spiral downward and being powerless to stop it. "How many?" I asked quietly. "How many what?" "How many dogs like Titan are out there right now, trying to do their jobs with no guidance, no structure, no purpose?" Marcus's expression grew grave. "In this region alone, probably 50 or 60 that we know of. Nationwide, the numbers are in the thousands. Military working dogs have a retirement rate of less than 30%, but the ones who do make it home often end up in situations that are almost as traumatic as combat." Riley shifted on the floor, her hand moving to Titan's broad head. "Is that why he's been so intense? I thought he was just being protective because we've been living rough, but it's more than that, isn't it?" "He's been trying to do his job," I said, looking down at the magnificent animal who'd been carrying the weight of protecting his pack with no real understanding of civilian rules and expectations. Military working dogs don't have an off switch. They're trained to be constantly vigilant, constantly ready to respond to threats. When Jake died, Titan transferred all of that protective instinct to you. But Jake never told me he was trained. I thought he was just, I don't know, naturally protective." Marcus knelt down slowly, bringing himself to Titan's eye level without challenging the dog's position guarding Riley. "Titan, present arms," he said, in the crisp command voice that I recognized from my own training. Without hesitation, Titan shifted from his down position and extended his right front paw toward Marcus, holding it steady in a perfect salute position. It was a trick that some military dogs learned as a morale booster for troops, but it required specific training and conditioning. Riley gasped, staring at her dog like she'd never seen him before. How did he know to do that? Because Jake trained him, or more likely, Jake inherited him from someone else's training. These dogs sometimes change handlers multiple times during their service careers. When someone gets injured or killed, their dog partner gets reassigned to another handler in the same unit. The implications of that hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Titan lost Jake, but Jake might not have been his original handler either. This dog could have lost multiple partners over the course of his working life, and now he was trying to protect Riley with the desperate intensity of an animal who'd learned that the people he loved had a tendency to disappear forever. "We have to help them," I said, and the words came out with more certainty than I'd felt about anything in 2 years. "That's what I've been hoping you'd say," Marcus replied. "Because this network I've built, it works."
Riley's face flushed with embarrassment. "Yesterday morning, I had enough for 1 can of food, and I was hoping to find somewhere that might give me work today so I could buy more." Marcus was already moving toward the back of the salon. "Well, that's an easy problem to solve. I keep emergency supplies for situations like this." He disappeared into what I assumed was a storage area and returned with a large bag of high-quality dog food and 2 metal bowls. "Titan, release," I said, using the command that would let him know his guard duty was temporarily suspended. The big dog immediately relaxed, though he stayed close to Riley as she got to her feet. Marcus set the bowls down a safe distance away and filled one with food, the other with water. "Titan, chow time," Riley said, and the dog looked to her for permission before moving to the bowls with the disciplined approach of an animal who'd been trained to wait for authorization even when hungry. Good, I observed. He's still responding to proper protocol, even under stress. That's a sign of solid foundational training. Riley, Marcus said, while Titan's eating, why don't we get you cleaned up? There's a shower in the employee break room, and I think I've got some spare clothes that might fit you. The girl's eyes filled with tears that she tried to blink back. I don't know how to thank you. I was so scared that someone was going to take him away from me, and I didn't know what I was going to do. You don't have to thank us, I said firmly. You just have to be willing to learn how to work with him properly. These dogs need structure and purpose, but they also need handlers who understand their capabilities and limitations. While Riley cleaned up and Titan methodically worked his way through the first real meal he'd had in days, Marcus and I found ourselves standing in the relative quiet of the grooming area, watching Atlas explore the space with renewed interest. How did you really know? I asked. About me, I mean. That letter from Colonel Hendricks couldn't have been specific enough for you to identify me on sight. Marcus smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes. It wasn't, but when you walked in here this morning with a clearly undertrained German Shepherd who was obviously from working lines, carrying yourself like someone with military bearing despite trying to blend into civilian camouflage, I started paying attention. He gestured toward Atlas, who was now investigating a piece of grooming equipment with the focused curiosity of a dog who recognized professional-grade tools. Then I watched how you handled him, the positioning, the situational awareness, the way you automatically scanned for exit routes and potential threats. Plus, Atlas isn't just any rescue dog, is he? I felt my carefully maintained cover story crumbling completely. What do you mean? He's got the bone structure and conditioning of a working dog, but he's never had formal training. My guess is he was bred for military or police work but washed out of the program before certification. Probably too sensitive or too reactive for combat deployment, but with all the intelligence and drive that made him a candidate in the first place. The accuracy of his assessment was unsettling. Atlas had indeed been bred by a military contractor, but he'd been released from the program at 18 months old due to what the trainers had diplomatically called environmental sensitivities. In other words, he was too smart and too empathetic for the kind of controlled aggression required of working dogs in combat situations. I adopted him because I saw something familiar, I admitted. The intelligence, the energy, the need for structure. I thought maybe we could help each other figure out how to be civilians. And how's that working out for you? I looked around the salon, at Riley emerging from the back room looking cleaner and more hopeful than she had when she'd arrived, at Titan finishing his meal with the satisfied efficiency of a well-trained soldier, at Atlas investigating his surroundings with alert interest instead of destructive anxiety. How did you really know? I asked. About me, I mean. That letter from Colonel Hendricks couldn't have been specific enough for you to identify me on sight. Marcus smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes. It wasn't, but when you walked in here this morning with a clearly undertrained German Shepherd who was obviously from working lines, carrying yourself like someone with military bearing despite trying to blend into civilian camouflage, I started paying attention. He gestured toward Atlas, who was now investigating a piece of grooming equipment with the focused curiosity of a dog who recognized professional-grade tools. Then I watched how you handled him, the positioning, the situational awareness, the way you automatically scanned for exit routes and potential threats. Plus, Atlas isn't just any rescue dog, is he? I felt my carefully maintained cover story crumbling completely. What do you mean? He's got the bone structure and conditioning of a working dog, but he's never had formal training. My guess is he was bred for military or police work but washed out of the program before certification. Probably too sensitive or too reactive for combat deployment, but with all the intelligence and drive that made him a candidate in the first place. The accuracy of his assessment was unsettling. Atlas had indeed been bred by a military contractor, but he'd been released from the program at 18 months old due to what the trainers had diplomatically called environmental sensitivities. In other words, he was too smart and too empathetic for the kind of controlled aggression required of working dogs in combat situations. I adopted him because I saw something familiar, I admitted. The intelligence, the energy, the need for structure. I thought maybe we could help each other figure out how to be civilians.
And how's that working out for you? I looked around the salon, at Riley emerging from the back room looking cleaner and more hopeful than she had when she'd arrived, at Titan finishing his meal with the satisfied efficiency of a well-trained soldier, at Atlas investigating his surroundings with alert interest instead of destructive anxiety. Not as well as I'd hoped, I said honestly. We're both too restless, too purposeless. I thought if I could just be normal enough, quiet enough, he'd settle into being a regular pet. But that's not who either of us are. No, Marcus agreed. It's not, and there's nothing wrong with that. The problem isn't that you're too military for civilian life. The problem is that you've been trying to waste your training instead of finding ways to use it constructively. Riley reappeared, wearing clean jeans and a sweater that were slightly too large but infinitely better than the clothes she'd arrived in. Her hair was damp from the shower, and the exhausted desperation that had dominated her expression earlier had been replaced by something that looked cautiously optimistic. "How's he doing?" she asked, checking on Titan, who had finished eating and was now lying in a relaxed downstay position. "Much better," I said. "Food helps with stress responses, especially in dogs who've been living in survival mode. But Riley, we need to talk about what happens next." She nodded, settling down cross-legged beside Titan, who immediately shifted to put his head in her lap. "Marcus told me about the housing program and about the training you might be able to provide. I want to learn. I want to do right by him." "It's not going to be easy," I warned. "Working with dogs like Titan requires consistency, patience, and a complete reorganization of how you think about the relationship between human and animal. He's not a pet who happens to be protective. He's a highly trained specialist who needs a job to do." "What kind of job?" I looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. "That depends on what you're interested in and what he's capable of. Therapy work with veterans suffering from PTSD, search and rescue operations, even some forms of security work, if you're both up for the training." Riley's eyes widened. "You mean he could actually help people? Like, professionally?" "Dogs like Titan are some of the most capable animals on the planet," I explained. "The problem is that without proper channeling, all that capability turns into anxiety and destructive behavior. But with the right training and the right handler, he could do incredible things." "And you'd teach me how to be the right handler?" I felt something shift inside my chest, a sense of rightness that I hadn't experienced since my discharge. This was what I'd been missing, what Atlas had been missing. Not the adrenaline and danger of combat, but the sense of purpose that came from using your skills to help others. "We'd teach each other," I said, "because honestly, I need to learn how to do this work in civilian contexts as much as you need to learn how to handle Titan properly." Marcus cleared his throat, drawing our attention back to him. "If you're both serious about this, I'd like to propose something. Sarah, I've been looking for a partner in the K-9 network for over a year. Someone with field experience who can handle the behavioral training and handler education components. The position comes with a salary, benefits, and housing if you need it. Riley," he continued, "we've got that apartment I mentioned, and we've also got several part-time positions available for people who want to learn the business while they're getting their own situation stabilized. Nothing glamorous, mostly cleaning kennels and helping with basic animal care, but it's honest work and it comes with hands-on training." I felt Atlas lean against my leg again, his solid presence reminding me that whatever decision I made would affect both of us. When I looked down at him, his tail gave a cautious wag, and I could swear there was approval in his expression. "What would the work actually involve?" I asked, because despite my growing certainty that this was the right path, I needed to understand exactly what I'd be committing to. "Intake assessments for dogs and handlers who come to us for help," Marcus explained. "Developing training programs tailored to individual needs and capabilities. Teaching handler education classes for people like Riley. Coordinating with other veteran service organizations to identify dogs and handlers who need assistance." He paused, studying my face. "And occasionally handling the kind of crisis intervention we just dealt with here. Dogs and handlers in immediate distress who need someone who understands both sides of the partnership." "Like today," I said. "Like today," he confirmed, though hopefully with advance warning and better preparation next time. Riley was listening to this conversation with growing excitement. "So I could learn to work with Titan professionally and maybe help other people who are in the same situation I was in this morning?" Eventually, I said, but first you need to master the basics of handling him safely and effectively. Military working dogs require a completely different approach than civilian pets, and if you don't understand the fundamentals, you could end up in
Atlas was back on the grooming table, submitting to Marcus's professional attention with the patient dignity of a dog who understood that sometimes you had to tolerate necessary procedures for the greater good. Riley was filling out paperwork with Titan lying calmly beside her chair, both of them displaying the kind of relaxed focus that spoke of stress finally beginning to lift. "You know what the best part of this job is?" Marcus asked as he worked. "What's that?" "Every success story creates another resource for the next family that needs help. Riley's going to learn how to handle Titan properly, but she's also going to understand exactly what it feels like to be in crisis with a working dog. When the next scared kid shows up with a 90-pound problem they can't solve, she'll be able to help in ways that someone who hasn't lived through it never could." I thought about that, about the possibility of building something that could sustain itself and grow over time. A support network that actually understands the specific challenges. Exactly. Veterans helping veterans, handlers teaching handlers, dogs working with dogs who speak the same language. Marcus paused in his grooming to study Atlas's coat. "Speaking of which, this boy's got some interesting scars under all this fur. Old injuries that healed well but left marks." I stiffened slightly because those scars represented memories I hadn't shared with anyone, not even my therapist at the VA. He had some health issues when he was younger. "Military contractor breeding program injuries, if I had to guess," Marcus said calmly. "Probably from socialization exercises or early protection training that got a little too intense for a sensitive dog." The accuracy of his assessment shouldn't have surprised me anymore, but it still caught me off guard. "How do you know so much about military breeding programs?" "Because I consulted for several of them during my active duty years," Marcus replied. "Helped evaluate dogs for specialized programs, worked with handlers who were struggling with difficult assignments, that sort of thing. I've seen a lot of Atlas's type over the years." He finished the section he was working on and moved to the other side, his hands gentle but thorough. "Dogs who have all the intelligence and drive for working roles but lack the emotional resilience for combat deployment. Most programs wash them out and place them as civilian pets, but the smart ones end up with handlers who recognize their potential." "And you think Atlas has potential for this kind of work?" "I think Atlas has been waiting his whole life for this kind of work," Marcus corrected. "Look at how he's handling this environment, how he's responding to the structure and purpose. This morning he was a bundle of nervous energy with nowhere to direct it. This afternoon he's calm, focused, and engaged." He was right. Atlas was displaying the kind of settled alertness I remembered from military working dogs who were confident in their roles and comfortable with their handlers. Not the hyper-vigilant anxiety that had characterized most of our civilian life together, but the relaxed competence of an animal who understood his job and trusted his team. "What do you think, buddy?" I asked Atlas directly. "Ready to get back to work?" His tail wagged once, a deliberate gesture that seemed to convey more certainty than I'd felt about anything in 2 years. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe we'd both been waiting for this opportunity without realizing what we were waiting for. By the time we finished all the paperwork and planning, the sun was setting over Millbrook Falls, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me why I'd chosen this place to disappear. It was beautiful here, peaceful in a way that felt sustainable instead of fragile. Riley and Titan were settled into their new apartment with enough supplies to last them through their first week, and both of them had appointments for comprehensive assessments the following Monday. Riley would start work at the facility on Tuesday, beginning with basic animal care training while she learned the fundamentals of working dog handling. I was scheduled to begin developing training curricula and program protocols, starting with handler education classes that would launch within the month. It felt overwhelming and exciting and terrifying all at once, like stepping off a cliff and discovering you could fly. "You know," Marcus said as we locked up the salon, "I never asked what made you decide to trust me. Most discharged handlers are pretty cautious about revealing their backgrounds." I considered the question as we walked toward our cars, Atlas trotting beside me with the satisfied exhaustion of a dog who'd had a very full day. "I think it was watching you work with him," I said finally, "and then seeing how you handled the crisis with Riley and Titan. You moved like someone who'd been in situations like that before, someone who knew how to read the dynamics and respond appropriately. Plus," I added, "Atlas liked you, and he's got excellent judgment about people." Marcus laughed, a sound that carried genuine warmth and amusement. "Well, I'm glad we passed the K-9 character assessment. That's usually the most reliable evaluation you can get." As I drove home with Atlas in the passenger seat, I found myself thinking about Luna for the first time in months without feeling like someone was driving knives into my chest. She was still gone, and that loss would always be part of me. But maybe there was a way to honor her memory that didn't involve hiding from everything we'd learned together. Maybe the best way to remember her was to use everything she'd taught me about partnership and trust and the incredible things that humans and dogs work together towards something larger than themselves. Atlas rested his head on the center console, close enough that I could scratch behind his ears while I drove. Tomorrow, we'd start building something new, something that honored our past while creating a future worth working toward. For the first time since my discharge, that felt like enough. 6 months later, I stood in the training field behind the K-9 Veterinary Assistance Network facility, watching Riley work with Titan through an advanced protection sequence. The transformation in both of them was remarkable. Riley moved with the confident precision of someone who'd learned to read her dog's signals and respond appropriately, while Titan demonstrated the focused discipline of an animal who finally understood his role and trusted his handler completely. "Beautiful work," I called out as they completed the exercise. "Your timing on that redirect was perfect." Riley beamed with pride as she rewarded Titan with enthusiastic praise and his favorite tug toy. 6 months ago, she'd been a scared young woman sleeping in doorways with a reactive dog she couldn't control. Now she was 3 weeks away from her certification as a therapy dog handler, with plans to work with veterans suffering from PTSD at the regional VA hospital. The program had grown beyond anything Marcus and I had initially envisioned. Word had spread through military networks and veteran organizations, bringing us families from across the region who needed help with military working dogs struggling in civilian environments. We now operated 3 residential facilities, employed 12 full-time staff members, and had a waiting list that stretched 4 months into the future. Atlas trotted over from where he'd been supervising a group training session, his official therapy dog vest marking him as one of our certified emotional support specialists. He'd taken to the work with enthusiasm that bordered on obsession, displaying an intuitive understanding of when someone needed comfort and when they needed space to process their emotions. "How's the new intake family doing?" I asked Marcus as he approached with a clipboard full of assessment notes. "Better than expected," he replied. "The daughter is only 14, but she's got natural instincts for working with her father's dog. German short-haired pointer, explosive detection specialist. The father is still struggling with some adjustment issues, but watching his daughter succeed with the dog is helping him remember why he wanted to bring the animal home in the first place." That had become one of our most important discoveries over the past months. Military working dogs didn't just need handlers who understood their training. They needed entire families who could adapt to living with animals whose capabilities and needs were fundamentally different from typical pets. Children often prove to be naturals at this work, approaching the dogs without the emotional baggage that sometimes complicated adult relationships. "Any word from Dr. Vasquez about the therapy program expansion?" I asked. Marcus smiled, consulting his notes. "Approved for 6 additional dogs at the hospital, and they want to add a pediatric component working with children who've experienced trauma. Apparently, the combination of highly trained dogs and handlers who understand both military and civilian PTSD is producing better results than traditional therapy alone." The therapy program had been Riley's idea originally. She'd suggested that dogs like Titan, who were trained to read human emotional states and respond protectively, might be perfectly suited to help veterans who were struggling with hypervigilance and social anxiety. The pilot program had been so successful that we now have requests from treatment facilities across 3 states. A car pulled into the gravel parking area, and I recognized the federal license plates immediately. Colonel Hendricks stepped out of the passenger side, followed by a man in civilian clothes who moved with the unmistakable bearing of active-duty military personnel. "Commander Carter," Colonel Hendricks called out as she approached, "I hope you don't mind the surprise visit, but I wanted to see the operation for myself." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that always accompanied unexpected contact with my former military life, but it was manageable now. "Of course, Colonel. Always good to see you." "This is Major Thompson from the Military Working Dog Program at Lackland," she said, introducing her companion. "He's been following our reports about your success rates here, and he has a proposal for you." Major Thompson stepped forward with the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to getting things done efficiently. "Commander, we've been analyzing the data from your program, and frankly, we're impressed. You're achieving integration success rates that are significantly higher than anything we've seen in traditional veteran services." "We have good dogs and dedicated people," I replied carefully. "It's not rocket science." "Maybe not," Thompson agreed, "but it's something we need to replicate on a larger scale. We're dealing with increasing numbers of working dogs who complete their service commitments but struggle with civilian placement. Traditional adoption programs aren't equipped to handle animals with specialized training and specific psychological needs." Colonel Hendricks pulled out a tablet and showed me a series of charts and statistics. "What